It is nice to be back. I think it was about 10 years ago I came to the financial management program. Let me start with a confession. I think when it comes to leadership, I don't have really much in the way of real formal training. Most importantly, as Bob said, I don't have an MBA, so I guess that's something you should think about. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts. I was the oldest of 8 kids, or am the oldest of 8 kids. My dad was a lawyer and a sometime politician. My mom was a former home economics teacher and a math teacher. As Bob said, I graduated from Boston College with a degree in Russian and English literature, so I'm a big believer in the liberal arts. Spent a semester in 1973 in Russia, then went to SAIS, the Johns Hopkins School of International Relations. So one of the things when I look back on my life is it's been a series, I guess, of reinventions. I started my career at what is today Accenture. Back then it was Anderson Consulting. I spent 5 years at Bain & Company, working for Mitt Romney, among others. Was at Avon as head of strategy, and then as Bob said, running their international perfume division. Made some acquisitions, ran it, spun it off. So I did the whole 9 yards there. And then landed at Pepsico, where I was in various finance roles until I had the good sense to get out of finance in 2000, just before Sarbanes-Oxley was passed. So I, at that point, went off to Europe to run Frito-Lay Europe, Africa, Middle East, where I was based in London originally and then Geneva for 3.5 years, which was a terrific experience. And then in 2003, Steve Reinemund, our former CEO, asked me to take responsibility for our international business, which at the time was 2 different divisions, Pepsi International and Frito-Lay International, and they didn't talk together a lot either. Steve was convinced that by putting the 2 together, in some way, we could accelerate our growth in international, and he asked me to lead the transformation. When I thought about integrating the 2 divisions, I certainly had worked in both and felt it was important to strike a key balance. We needed to capture the potential of a leaner, more unified organization. But at the same time, we had to respect the unique differences between the businesses. The business models are somewhat different between a franchise business and a make, sell, deliver operating business on the Frito side, as well as the competitive challenges. You don't compete with our red friends in Atlanta part-time, that's for sure. But 3 years later, looking back on that transformation, I think it's worked out pretty well. Our revenues have grown, compounded 15% to about $13 billion. Our profits have grown faster, 23% per year to $2 billion. And our current plans call for us to add another $1 billion in profits over the next 3 to that. We've improved our profitability. We were about 11% when I took over, and we are well into mid-teens and a little bit better than mid-teens, I would say, this year. And along the way, we've become PepsiCo's largest single operating division. As Bob said, 37% of PepsiCo's revenue, 27% of its profit. But last year we were 62% of PepsiCo's profit growth. The international includes all of our brands, Pepsi, Frito-Lay, Gatorade, Tropicana, Quaker Foods, and a number of other local brands that we have. We're in about 200 countries with about 90,000 people, representing obviously a diverse variety of languages, religions, and cultures. And when I look ahead, our goal is pretty simple. We want to continue to expand our international presence in convenient foods and beverages, and along the way, be able to grow our profits at least mid-teens year in and year out. Fortunately, we still have tons of growth potential. I like to say in North America, the U.S. and Canada, we sell about $68 of our products to every man, woman, and child every year. In international, we sell $3. So even if I cut out half the world's population as maybe not affording our products, that's $6. We still have a long way to go. Per capita consumption of our products is a fraction of what it is in the U.S. in both snacks and in beverages. We're number 2 in soft drinks, which is a huge industry of $100 billion, where per capita consumption is a fraction of the U.S. And in snacks, we're the global leader, obviously, with the Frito-Lay business. And with Gatorade, Tropicana, and Quaker, we've really just gotten started. So I would say we have tremendous growth opportunity. But to capture that, I think you need one thing, which you would probably guess what it is, and that's leadership. And that, I guess, is the heart of my challenge as CEO of our international business, providing effective leadership. But I would argue even more importantly, it's about nurturing, supporting, and developing effective leaders throughout our organization. Because if there's one thing you can be pretty sure of, not too many decisions get made in my office, much less sitting in New York. The real muscle of our organization are the country general managers and their leaders in those businesses, and we need lots of them. Providing that leadership, I think, in a global, complex world is a tough challenge. The world around us is changing every day. As a company, we're having to change to address societal issues today that weren't even on our radar screen just 5 years ago, whether it's global warming, whether it's water scarcity, whether it's health and wellness, obesity, HIV/AIDS, and more. Which I suppose all begs the question, so what are the qualities that I look for in successful global business leaders today? And I thought in trying to answer that, I would kind of share a few of my own observations from what I've learned in my career. Unfortunately, I've had the chance to learn from and watch an incredible group of successful leaders and mentors, from my dad to school teachers that I had growing up to some terrific CEOs, from Hicks Waldron and Jim Preston at Avon, and a whole passel of CEOs at PepsiCo, from Wayne Calloway to Don Kendall, who's 86 years old and still comes into my office to see how the international business is doing, to Roger Enrico, Steve Reineman, Craig Weatherup, Bob Morrison, who was running Quaker, and Mike Jordan, who's now running EDS. And when I think about them as leaders and what they might have in common, there are 6 critical characteristics I wanted to just touch on. The first trait, I think, is they all have perspective. They all have perspective. In my mind, perspective is the ability to see both the forest and the trees, and most importantly, to see how things do or do not interrelate. And in my mind, perspective is the key ingredient if you want to build a successful business strategy. I guess I had my first taste of perspective at high school, a Jesuit high school in the Boston area. One day as a freshman, the teacher came into English class, abruptly hauled a student out for misbehaving, which neither my friends nor I had noticed. All we heard was shouting and banging in the hallway, including the teacher yelling at the kid, "Go to the boys' room and wipe the blood off your face." A couple minutes later, they both came back into class, slammed the door, and the teacher asked us all to write about it. It was all pretty unsettling, especially at the beginning of your freshman year when you don't know any better and you have the reputation of the Jesuits to go with it. The teacher then asked us to read some of what we had written. Most recounted the bad behavior on the part of the student. Nobody mentioned the blood. Nobody mentioned the teacher's excessive response. And of course, it was all a setup to see how our perceptions are shaped by assumptions and sometimes biases, and how sometimes we see what we want to see, not necessarily what happened. Now, leaders, in my mind, that have perspective are never easily fooled. In fact, they're skilled in anticipating and identifying trends. Our former chairman, Steve Reineman, likes to say, leaders learn to see around corners. And I think Steve reflected that trait 6 years ago when he challenged us as a leadership team to tackle health and wellness as a consumer trend well before anybody else in our food and beverage industry saw that trend. Leaders, in my mind, that have perspective also have a broad and holistic view of the world rather than an internal focus. They get out of the office, they get into the market, they ask lots of questions, and they do a lot more listening than talking. Best example of that I can think of is Don Kendall, our co-founder, who retired 20 years ago, but is still fascinated by our business. Recently, to celebrate our 25th anniversary in China, I asked Don to come with me to China. He was like a kid in a candy store seeing the country for the first time in over 20 years. He was bubbling over with questions. He wanted to know more about everything he saw, and when you watched him walk on a plant tour, he had his head in every machine asking questions about how things work. And I guess one of the lessons I learned is at age 86, he still has the curiosity of a child. And I think that, too, is one of the key elements of great leadership. In addition to that, great leaders like Don have the ability to process and synthesize all the information, sift through it, figure out what's relevant, and then use it to develop a workable plan. Colin Powell once said, "Great leaders are almost always great simplifiers." I agree, but with one caveat. They don't oversimplify. And in a complex world like the one we live in, I think that's critically important. You need to be able to cut through the clutter and find a workable solution that everyone can buy into and understand. The second of my 6 qualities is that great leaders know how to drive executional excellence. Execution, as I see it, is the ability to turn strategy into results. And great leaders have a passion for delivering results. If the ground underneath them shifts, they face reality and they adjust to achieve their goals. And they do that by tackling issues with a real sense of urgency, by building clear plans that specify goals and actions that are clear to the entire organization. They're effective at mobilizing and aligning resources, whether it's people or investments or plants or whatever it takes to get the job done. And they have a watchful eye. They stay engaged, they monitor progress, and they're not shy about following up to ask questions on how things are going. Ultimately, I suppose strong execution requires decisiveness, because in competitive businesses, someone's always out there ready to eat your lunch or drink your Pepsi. And waiting for all the information you'd like before you act can be fatal. Particularly in international, the best leaders I know have the 70-30 rule. If you've got 70% of the information you need, it's probably time to make a decision. Because if you hold out for the last 30%, you're probably toast. So great leaders have an ability to execute as well. Third, I think particularly in this world we live in today, to be a great leader, you have to be an effective change agent. Now, let's all be honest. None of us particularly like change, much less getting up at a different hour in the morning. In a rapidly changing world, though, companies don't hire leaders to maintain the status quo, and we certainly don't. Driving change for the better is what leaders do, or I think at least what we try to do. Now, it's not always easy, and it starts, I think, with having the courage to change even when things are good, and sometimes when things are not so good. I remember well in 1996, I was CFO of our Pepsi business. Roger Enrico was PepsiCo's CFO, and he announced that the company was going to spin off its $10 billion restaurant business. Forbes magazine spent a lot of time interviewing Roger for a big article on the plan. And when it was finally published, it declared the plan, quote, was a huge and irretrievable strategic blunder. Well, I think history has proven pretty clearly that Roger made the right decision. But at the time, it took a lot of courage, and I might say in this blogging media world, a fairly thick skin as well. Besides courage, driving change successfully, I think, requires knowing what to change, but equally important, what not to change. It involves always building a coalition, an alliance of supporters, and it means knowing how to instill in others that same sense of ownership in the change. That certainly requires strong communication skills. Perhaps the textbook case of that was 1996. As newly appointed CFO of our international soft drink business, I did a speech 2 months after taking the job on April Fool's Day 1996 called The 5 Warning Signs of a Heart Attack. Unfortunately, the heart attack hit a lot faster and a lot more severely 2 months after that, when I had to go to our board with an $800 million write-off. That tends to teach you lessons that stay with you. I'd learned the hard way that, frankly, as we chased our international business, we'd invested way too far ahead of our people and our systems capabilities. The fourth quality common to great leaders in my mind is that they're self-aware and savvy. Now, savvy is a tough word to translate into other languages, but I think it is a rich word in terms of what I mean. The best leaders I know their own strengths and, more importantly, their own weaknesses and blind spots. They read people well. They understand other people's motivations and what makes them tick. And they know how to flex their style when needed to relate to other people, particularly in a diverse environment like International presents. I guess some people might call it street smarts. Even in unfamiliar situations, they can figure out what to do. That means they have what I'd call organizational or cultural savvy as well, which is the ability to understand sometimes conflicting perspectives and priorities of others across the organization or even across the globe, and the ability to work through those differences to get things done. Doing that often requires, I guess, an ability to manage paradoxes, like reconciling both the short-term and long-term interests of the business and building consensus across multiple constituencies. The fifth of the six criteria is that all of the great leaders I know have unshakable integrity. Now again, integrity is a terrific word, but it doesn't translate very well into many languages around the world, so you have to use more than one word to describe it often. But fundamentally, I guess it's about true north. It's about having principles, moral leadership, inner strength. If you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, Paul Rusesabagina, the hotel manager, is exactly what I have in mind. The kind of individual, didn't have an MBA either, but seemed to know what the right thing to do was in an extraordinarily challenging time to make the right decision based on values. Being an English major, I guess I'd have to use a little bit of English literature here. If you've read Shakespeare's Hamlet, you'd probably recognize the advice that Polonius gave to his son Laertes. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. 400 years later, I think it's still pretty good advice for a global business leader. I guess growing up as the oldest of 8 kids, I noticed that the younger ones tended to follow my lead, for better, sometimes for worse. In their eyes, I was the leader, and if I did something, they just presumed it was okay for them to do it too. And I guess it's not so different in business. All of us as leaders need to set the moral tone and ethical standards for our organizations, because people are watching us every day. One of the frustrating things about being a leader is you're never off mic. Based on this, people make judgments about what we really value and whether we're open to hearing the unvarnished truth. The great leaders that I've observed never try to rationalize a questionable course of action. As my good friend Craig Weatherup, the former CEO of our bottling group, liked to say, there's no right way to do the wrong thing. As leaders, we need to do the right thing all the time. But sometimes it's right versus right, particularly in International. So when you have questions or concerns about which way to go, I try and suggest to folks, ask for help, and you'll never get in trouble. Now, this might surprise you too, but the greatest leaders I've watched also have a real sense of humility. In fact, they have this kind of paradox. They have a tremendous strength of themselves in some respects, but they also have enough humility to know what they don't know. And they're not afraid to seek the advice and counsel of others. So fundamentally, to me, integrity is critical. And finally, I guess I would say great leaders build strong teams. Lou Holtz, one of football's most successful coaches, even though it was Notre Dame and I went to Boston College, said, quote, "It's a fine thing to have ability, but the ability to discover ability in others is the true test." I think he's right, because business leaders don't really lead inanimate businesses. We all lead people. Successful leaders continually build and stretch the capabilities of their people, something I would say Andy Pearson taught us at PepsiCo. They're both great teachers and great coaches. At PepsiCo, we have a pretty well-established tradition of senior executives making major commitments to developing people. Roger Enrico used to spend several weeks a year running a leadership program near his ranch in Montana, and it was a terrific week. Steve Reineman ran one at Darden. And I've developed and run an international leadership program for our top leaders in International a week each summer in Switzerland. Now, of course, building people capability means lots of things, and you can never spend enough time on it as a leader. It means having high standards when you hire new people, not just filling jobs, but reaching out broadly to develop a full, and I would say most importantly, a diverse slate of candidates so you're sure you're getting the very best. It means fostering a truly inclusive organization in which people of many different backgrounds feel welcome and able to achieve their full potential. And that's particularly important in an organization as diverse as PepsiCo International. It means balancing the short-term and long-term interests of the business to ensure that people get the critical development experiences, even if you might be taking a risk in putting someone into a bigger job than you might otherwise be comfortable. It means having a commitment to regularly providing coaching and constructive feedback to everybody on your team. And it means taking the time to do thoughtful succession planning, not just weeks or months ahead when you need it, but years in advance. And finally, it means maintaining and encouraging a positive work environment with a clear commitment to the challenge at hand. I once heard someone say that the first task of a leader is to keep hope alive. I certainly think that's true. People look to their leaders for encouragement and optimism. They want to know that we believe in the mission and that it is a noble mission. Now, all those things are important in building a strong organization, but it also is important how you interact with your people. And in my mind, that means a few things. It means first operating with openness and candor, because people aren't going to follow someone whose motives they suspect. And I would say if there's a lesson we learned in 1996, it's that great leaders are particularly adept at handling bad news in a constructive way. Craig Weatherford, in fact, had an interesting view. He said, good news is great, everybody loves it, has 1,000 fathers. Bad news is an orphan. And when you're the leader of the organization, it's your job to deal with the bad news and to demand the bad news. And by the way, how well you deal with the bad news will tell whether you'll ever get to hear the bad news again. Second, trust the people around you. That frees you to delegate responsibility and empower others to fully leverage the talent of your team. Third, be consistent. Flexibility is important, but a leader that changes priorities too often is only going to confuse or worse, demoralize their team. Now, building strong teams in an international business, I think, perhaps presents some unique challenges. How do you go about bringing cohesion to an organization that comprises so many different nationalities, cultures, ethnicities, languages, and religions? Well, I could say sometimes it feels like herding cats, but I think it's a pretty simple idea. When Vernon and Jordan spoke to us at our senior leadership meeting a year ago, he talked long about diversity and inclusion, but frankly, it wasn't connecting with our international folks. And after his talk, someone asked him a question, because he'd spent so much time talking about growing up in the South in the United States, about what the core of diversity and inclusion really was. And he said, it's simple, really. It's about mutual respect and understanding. Well, as someone who travels all over the world, I can tell you if there's one thing we desperately need in the world right now is more mutual respect and understanding between nations. People know whether you respect them, and if they sense that you don't, you'll never get their very best. Our former chairman, Wayne Calloway, used to say, listen and speak in the proportion God intended, noting that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. I'd say it's particularly good advice in an international environment. Managing cross-culturally clearly entails sensitivity to other cultures and customs. For instance, in the Middle East, their weekend is Friday, Saturday. In Asia, with the time zone difference, it's either their night or my night that we tend to be speaking. It's a million little things that you need to do to be sensitive to different cultures. But fundamentally, it starts with building a culture that celebrates diversity and encourages inclusion. Managing across cultures, I think, requires you also to be good at managing what I call the global-local paradox. Yes, you need to be clear about what's global, whether it's our values, our brand positioning and the look of the Pepsi logo, our global IT network, or how we leverage scale where we can in global purchasing. But equally important, you need to be flexible so that you not only accept local initiatives, but in fact you encourage them. So while I'm real interested in leveraging our global scale, I kind of have this philosophy that it's like in baseball, tie goes to the runner. In business, if it's a tie between global and local, I'll vote for local every time, because then people will own it. So we challenge our local teams to leverage what's distinctive about their nation, their culture, their cuisine, and to ensure that our products and our marketing are truly locally relevant. We encourage them to tailor our products, particularly our snacks, to suit local tastes and customs. We have local flavors ranging from curry-flavored lentil snacks in India to Peking duck in China, to cheese and onion in the UK, to feta cheese in Greek, to chili limon in Mexico. And all of that just on Lay's. And finally, when it comes to managing across cultures, you better have lots of communication. We do an awful lot via email, voicemail, and so on and so forth. We're not big on sending memos to each other. But we also have a pretty systematic process for sharing best practices and new product platforms that I started when I was running Europe. We call it our Foundation for Growth. We do it at the beginning of the strategic plan cycle, where we get everybody together for what's a virtual trade show of innovation from around the world, so that as they think about their strategies, they can take advantage of all of the ideas that we have in PI and in North America to build their strategies around. All of these things taken together, I think, help build a real sense of local ownership and pride in our people. So those are the 6 characteristics of great leaders. They have perspective, they can drive executional excellence, they're effective change agents, they're self-aware and savvy, they have unshakable integrity, and they build strong teams. There are lots of others, I'm sure, that are important in building leadership, but I think if you have those qualities, you'll go a long way. Let me close with just a little bit of career advice. You didn't ask, but I'll give it anyway. I think it's pretty simple. A couple things. First, discover what you're good at, develop it, and leverage it. And don't presume you've already figured out at your age what you're really good at. I didn't realize I was good in finance and in analytics until I was 33, 34 years old. Didn't think of the fact that my mother was a former math teacher, but there you have it. I majored in English. What can I tell you? But you'll go furthest and be happiest if you know your own strengths and you find a career where you can leverage them. Second, build a portfolio of critical experiences. Go out of your way to find situations that are going to really challenge and stretch you. Cope with different situations, whether it's line or staff roles, domestic or international assignments, in growth businesses or in turnarounds. That's what's given me the perspective and the confidence to deal, I think, with pretty much any challenge. Third, go wide and go deep. Look, we live in a pretty complex world that's increasingly specialized. So early in your career, I think it's important to develop what we call a hip pocket skill, something that you're really good at, where you can build a depth of expertise that any specialist would admire. But as you can imagine, as a liberal arts graduate, I'm also a pretty big believer that to be a really great leader, you need to supplement that depth with the kind of breadth of perspective, sensitivity, and curiosity that goes with being well-rounded that you often get in a liberal arts background as a generalist. Fourth, be a lifelong learner. I hate to tell you, I know second year is even harder than the first year here, according to Sean. But guess what? Your education is just beginning. You know, my dad was a lawyer, so I always presumed that you graduated from law school and you practiced law, and that was it. And I worked for Jim Preston at Avon once upon a time, and when I got to the company, he was 50 years old and widely known as a great salesman. But nobody saw him as CEO material. In fact, I was told by Hicks Waldron that Jim wasn't strategic enough, which is why I was being brought in. But during the 2 years I worked with Jim, I watched him learn and grow as a leader, and in 1988, Jim was named CEO, and nobody deserved it more. So even at 50, he was able to learn and grow. So look, listen, explore, and learn. Stay open to new experiences. Travel, continue to read, and try new things, because I think those who are the most naturally curious and open-minded will go the furthest as leaders. And finally, have a passion for excellence. The ancient Greeks had a phrase, "Ion aristuein," happens to be the motto of Boston College, ever to excel. And in my mind, excellence, like leadership, is a journey, not a destination. Why not be the best that you can be? So to me, that's what true leadership is all about, and I wish you great success in your personal leadership journey. Seize the opportunity. Thanks. Some questions?
Many of our professors in strategy classes, for example, have said that the sort of organizational style of having a North American business and an international business is something that's maybe outmoded, that it's an archaic concept. Why is it right for PepsiCo, and what do you think of it?
Great question. And Steve Reineman and I have talked about that question a lot. You know, I think every business is different, and you have to look at what the global business model is. You know, if you're making software, that's probably the right model for you, because you make it in one place, you have all your R&D people in one place, and that's it. We're in the food business, and, you know, God created differences, gender differences, music differences, language differences, and one of the other ones is cuisine. People like different foods. And so for us, we're much more of what I would call a multi-local business. The other thing is I can't ship Lay's potato chips or Pepsi from the U.S. affordably anywhere in the world. So when we build our business, we build it locally. I mean, we need to be able to bottle the Pepsi. We make the concentrate in Ireland, but we bottle it in the country. In potato chips, we have to work with local farmers to grow the potatoes locally in every country. So the preponderance of the business model is a local business model. Now, there are global things that we can leverage and share. The other reality is managing emerging markets, I would argue, is quite different than managing a huge monster like Frito-Lay US. I mean, the Frito-Lay US business, what is it, $7-8 billion in revenue with all kinds of sophistication, vertically integrated, which is a huge competitive advantage for Frito. Okay? My typical emerging market is $150 million in revenue. I can't afford their systems. I have to redesign everything the US does because it's not affordable. So I think in our case, it's right for us for now. But it could change. I mean, and it's something we're constantly looking at. I'm a big believer that organizations should follow strategy. And I think you have to look at what the competition is. In the case of snacks, our competition is local. You need to understand the competition. You need to understand the business model and the strategy, and then figure out what's right in a given circumstance. But it's a great question. Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you handle HR issues across so many different countries, particularly at the management level, at the country level, whether you have significant pay differences and how you sort of juggle that as you grow a company.
HR issues. So I'd like to tell you we don't have any. However, look, again, we are primarily a multi-local business. I can't afford to have one salary scale or one set of benefits for the world. I'd bankrupt the business in India and in China and Vietnam and in a whole bunch of other countries in Mexico. So first and foremost, most of our benefits policies, our compensation is all going to be determined locally. And we have the same philosophy globally. So our philosophy of paying at the third quartile in peer group companies is the same philosophy globally. But I'm going to benchmark in China against the other multinationals and other big Chinese companies in China and figure out what's appropriate under the circumstances. Now, we have at PepsiCo a very strong tradition of strong HR and strong finance, strong CFOs and strong CPOs who have a dotted line to their functional boss. They report solid to their general manager. And we work those dotted lines real hard. So my CPO, Ronnie Miller Hasday, based in New York, has regular functional meetings with her counterpart CPOs in the 6 regions that we have around the world. But in our case, again, for our business, we don't have that many expats left. When I named my leadership team in 2003, I didn't even think about it. I just picked the best 8 people in the 8 regions that we had then, and someone pointed out to me that not one was an American except me. I said, well, it just so happened that I had a pretty diverse talent pool to draw from. Yeah.
How do you think about market entry strategy into different countries? Can you talk about what you're specifically looking for, and what are your metrics for success, and where have you withdrawn?
Let me take the first part of it first. the considerations are different in snacks versus beverages. On the snack side, because not everybody eats potato chips like an American, although I'm trying, the business is quite small. So often you've got to kind of decide, is the market big enough to warrant going in from a snack standpoint and creating all of the work it takes to run a snacks business, from agriculture to distribution to manufacturing. Usually the number one criteria I have is, do we have the people capability to manage an operation in that country? On the Pepsi side, where we've got local bottlers, you can oftentimes leverage local bottlers. So we're in 200 countries on the Pepsi side. We've been in 200 countries on Pepsi for forever because we're leveraging a local bottling system. But clearly you look at size and growth. You look at whether the country is open to foreign investment and whether they've got good free market policies. I think one of the hidden secrets of emerging markets is the number of them that have embraced Reaganomics. I mean, flat taxes, lowering tax rates. I mean, even ones you probably haven't heard about, like Pakistan and Egypt. Have both, the guy doing it in Egypt is a former partner of ours at Unilever, went into the government. The guy in Pakistan who's doing it used to work at Citibank, Shaukat Aziz. And it's amazing. Ukraine, the Baltics, the number of emerging markets that are now kind of onto this, trying to find a way to be more growth-oriented, and particularly in Asia, you find that. So in terms of an entry strategy, it's typically just where do I prioritize, how many bets can I digest at a given point in time, and do I have the people capability to manage it? In terms of withdrawal, there's probably only one withdrawal, which is a notable one. Well, there are a couple, I guess. One is we got out of Burma from the Pepsi business standpoint because of the issues there a number of years ago. We pulled out of South Africa during the apartheid days, and unfortunately our competitors stayed, and we got hurt because of it. It's an interesting ethical debate we could have on another occasion, because they have a monster Coke business in South Africa. We've tried to go back in a real small way, and it's been difficult. But I would say when you look at these kinds of issues, Don Kendall went to Russia in 1956 to do the kitchen debates and to try and sell Pepsi in Russia, and he's a big believer that business can be a key part of building relationships society to society. So I'm generally not in favor of pulling out of countries for some other noble cause, but there you have it. Yeah.
I was curious by your comment that you seek to pay people in the third quartile of comparable companies, and maybe there's an equity component in addition to that. But how do you try to find a first quartile people when you pay them in the third quartile?
How do we do what with the first quartile?
How do you try to find people that are the top quartile, or how do you find the best people when you're only willing to pay them the third quartile?
Well, I guess that's a great question. But if I said I'm going to go out and pay the highest salaries in the world, I'm not sure I need to. We benchmark against all of our peer companies, and we have a pretty long history of being pretty equity-oriented in our compensation. Now, one of the challenges in international is that a lot of people outside the U.S. had never valued the stock options they were getting, and so we've converted a lot more to restricted stock than to stock options over the years. But I don't know. You can do pretty well, actually, financially. I don't think you need to worry about building net worth in a company like PepsiCo. Our stocks perform pretty well over the long haul. So equity, look, for us, for senior management, equity-driven compensation is more than 50% of our comp. Salary becomes not that important, actually. Yeah.
This actually continues on from Tristan's question about how you enter into the new markets. And I noticed that you said up front that Pepsi has had to adjust to a number of societal issues, one of them being childhood obesity and health and wellness, which Pepsi was ahead of the curve to finally look at. I imagine that the societal pressuring in your more developed countries, whether it's the UK or the USA, are different to the pressures you see in your new markets. And I'm wondering how Pepsi sort of factors in lessons they've learned from the more developed markets into those new areas.
It's a great question, and I have a difficult answer for you. It's not easy. First of all, don't presume. The word travels these days. So whether it's India or whether it's Thailand wants to do stoplights on the bags like the UK does now. So, the word does travel even when it doesn't make any sense. Even if you look at the facts, in China, even if I just took 300 million people, forget the billion, on average they're having a small bag of potato chips once a month. Okay, so let's get the facts square first, that we're not much of a cause of obesity, frankly, in those markets. However, diabetes is growing substantially in a country like India, as it is in Mexico. And I don't think you can go in and not anticipate that that's going to come. On the other hand, how fast can I bring consumers along? So, for instance, we're launching a product called Pepsi Max in some of our emerging markets. We've had Pepsi Max, which, for those of you who don't know, I think is a great tasting regular cola. The U.S. is finally going to try something like Max this year. But we've had it international for 6-7 years. And in the UK, it's the lead no-sugar cola. In Norway, it's the lead no-sugar cola. But I have to be honest with you, in a lot of emerging markets, people don't think sugar is bad. We did some consumer work around launching it in Brazil and said, we've got this great new product, a no-sugar cola, and the consumer said, but sugar is good. Why are you taking the sugar out? So you have to respect that people have different perspectives, and it may take us a while. And so in the case of Pepsi Max, we said then let's focus on the calories instead of the sugar. You may have to flex your communication in different societies. The other thing that we're doing is we're growing our non-carb business. We're trying to accelerate the growth of our juice drinks business. But what you find about non-carbs is actually it's not at all a global business. It's a local business. And so you have to figure out locally what you're going to do, whether it's tea in China or whatever, and figure out what you can leverage on a global basis. Yeah.
Just a follow-on question to that. So with your answer, how did Pepsi think about entering the new markets and protecting their global image? Because there have been some articles written, justly or not justly. It sounds like the facts sort of don't really substantiate it. But how does Pepsi think about protecting their international image?
Well, first of all, again, let me remind you, we're in 200 countries on Pepsi, so we're really not entering any new countries. We're already there. But in terms of the global, let's call it reputation of the company, we have done an awful lot to start to build up the area of sustainability and corporate social responsibility. We have a Pepsico Foundation. 5 years ago, the foundation gave all kinds of good money in the United States and none to international. Steve Reineman asked me to sit on the foundation board starting in 2003. Now half of the money we donate goes to international, and it's everything from tsunami victims to the earthquakes in Pakistan, to building schools, we have a program in Mexico, for instance, called Activados. We're going to hit 1 million elementary school kids this year, teaching them about nutrition and physical exercise. So we've got a number of initiatives to try. I think one of the things you realize is that if you're going to be in business in this day and age, especially in emerging markets, the expectations on a company are greater than they ever were before. And just making a profit isn't going to be good enough. And we certainly understand that, and we have a program in China called the Mother Water Cellar Project. If you go to Shanghai, that's not China. That's like going to New York and thinking you've seen the United States. It is in the poorest parts of the country where people literally live in caves. We've come in and helped build cisterns to collect the rainwater so they would have water, and you wouldn't believe the transformation that makes in a rural area to the folks there. So we're going to need to do even more of that in the future, I think. It's got to become an integral part of our strategy work now. Is what are you doing on sustainability, environmental sustainability, what are you doing on health and wellness, and what are you doing on corporate social responsibility? It's not optional, not in this world. Yep.
Can you talk about some of the challenges you face personally in leading a global business and traveling so much and balancing that with your family lifestyle and friendships and other relationships?
Yeah. Well, first of all, my kids are older, so that helps. My youngest is 26, so I'm not sure I could do the amount of travel that I do. Second, my wife travels. PepsiCo's good enough to let her travel with me, about half the time, so she'll come on some trips. And that, by the way, in international, people are much more interested in relationships, believe it. In the U.S., things tend to be pretty transactional. In most societies outside the United States, family is real important, and usually having my wife come is a pretty big asset to me and what I try to get done apart from it's nice to have her with me. And relationships are really, really important. Now, it's a challenge juggling my travel schedule is probably the toughest thing that you do, and you have to be able to kind of go from one thing to another in a given day and not overreact to crises and problems or you go crazy, because in a world as big and diverse as ours, there's something going on all the time. But I think like everybody else, the biggest struggle is just kind of getting the right balance. But we've done some things. The other thing I would say is a lot of my friends work at PepsiCo. I mean, I'm blessed. I can go to just about any city in the world and have a friend. Last year, I said, okay, we're going through a trip through South America, Brazil, Chile, and then we were going to hit Mexico. And I said, let's do it over a weekend. And I took the top 4 guys and their wives to Machu Picchu. So I got a double bonus out of it. I got to see Machu Picchu, which is fantastic and well worth seeing. But the bonding that we did on the train there, I mean, as one of the guys said to me afterwards, you will never remember the operating plan I presented to you last November, but I will remember this weekend for the rest of my life. And, it doesn't cost that much money if you're smart about how you do those things. But I think it's important to think about relationships. Yeah.
This question is linked to the way strategic planning is done within Pepsi. So given that you have the virtual trade show at the beginning of the corporate planning cycle, what is the process within the company to ensure that the relevant innovations get incorporated?
Right.
And who is primarily responsible? Is it the country general managers, or how is that interaction managed with you?
Yeah, it is the country general managers who come in, and then so the way the cycle works, and the reason that I set it up the way I did, when we originally set it up, it really had 2 parts. It had a trade show part, which is, let me show you all of the stuff that's going on around the world. I was delighted to hear Coke say they were finally doing this. That's good. I started it in Europe in 2001. But the other part of it was a critical issues discussion. So what are the questions we're going to work on? And let's take enough time, because I'm a big believer that, if you get the question defined right, you got pretty good odds with smart people you'll get to the answer. But more often than not, you may think you've got the question right, but you don't. And so we take a fair amount of time on what I'd call kind of defining the critical issues, so that when they come back in June, because I do strat reviews in June, that we've already had them seen all of the innovation we got going on globally. They've got some sense of what our priorities are, because I've got a global strategy, and strategy doesn't change that often, frankly, whether it's health and wellness or whatever. And they've got a set of objectives and a list of critical issues. So, for instance, in China right now, how are we going to build our non-carb business? In Mexico, how are we going to overhaul our distribution system to make it more efficient, or whatever? And it's different issues in different countries. And then we go out. I mean, I do a kind of a bunch of I do people plan reviews first, and then strategy reviews in June, and then we present that to PepsiCo corporate in July. So that's how it works. One more question. Yeah.
So you mentioned that one of the most important roles that you have is actually developing leaders within PepsiCo. My question is, how far deep does that go within the culture of the company? And then at the same time, how do you deal with the difference in concept of leadership in different nations? I mean, say China, maybe mentoring is not so important. How do you go about doing all of that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, in terms of leadership, Wayne Calloway used to say he owns the top 100 talent at PepsiCo. I think 100 was probably about as many as he could remotely know a little bit about, and therefore add any value to the conversation. Similarly, for me, when we do our people plan reviews with each of the regions, I'd confuse you with our own band system and how that works, so I need to think about it in terms of the numbers. So, I'm going to focus on probably the top 100, 150 in PI, where I can, I probably know a little bit about each of them in the discussions that we have in both their development plans as well as on their succession plans. And, we do a people plan review, and half of it's on what are you doing to accelerate the culture, whether that's rolling out our values, building diversity and inclusion, from a culture standpoint, addressing org health issues. And then the second piece is on looking at succession planning, bench building, and so on and so forth, looking at the pools of talent, and then discussing specific individuals. That then cascades down, though. So, I do that with my 6 regions, the 6 region presidents, and then they're doing it, the country general managers are presenting to them. So it goes all the way down to the country level in terms of the organization, and probably, I would say it touches all of our management. certainly. I'm not sure I'd say we're quite as good going all the way down to the front line, but certainly management of the top 3,000 probably folks in PI. The other question was... yeah. Well, what's interesting, though, styles of leadership differ. I'm not sure the model of leadership. I mean, if you talk about what I laid out this morning, I think most of my folks would be nodding, yeah. I mean, it starts with having a common set of values. You better be pretty good at strategic thought leadership. You better be pretty good at getting results, and you better be pretty good at driving change and building a team. Now, styles are different, and I think one of the key things is to make sure that we have programs at the next level down. So as I said, Roger Enrico used to run his Montana program. I tiered it down a level and did my top 32 leaders, which is kind of country managers within PI that I was doing. And then my direct reports, I have a guy who runs the Middle East who's been doing his own leadership thing for the next level down for years. So, it is amazing. People tend to follow examples. And it certainly does resonate in our culture. Pretty much everybody, there's an Asia Leadership Academy that we run in Asia. And then we try and tailor things to where there are cultural differences, which is what I call more in the style mode. We'd bring those to play in talking about style differences. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Good luck.